I'm here today with Angela Denker, author of a book titled Red State Christians, A Journey into White Christian Nationalism and the Wreckage It Leaves Behind, from Broadleaf Books. This is an expanded version of Angela's original Red State Christians that was released in 2019. Angela is a Lutheran pastor and veteran journalist. She's written for many publications, including Sports Illustrated, The Washington Post, and Fortune magazine. She's also appeared on CNN, BBC, and Sky News to share her research on politics and Christian nationalism in the United States. I'm also very happy to say that Angela will be one of our featured speakers at our upcoming How to Write Dangerously online conference. You can follow Angela on Twitter at Angela_Denker, Denker. So Angela, thanks so much for joining us. It's really great to catch up with you again.
Yeah, good to see you.
Congratulations on the new book, or the expanded version of the previous book, however you want to look at it. But before we get into that, is there anything else that you'd like to tell folks about yourself besides what I mentioned?
Oh, wow. Well, I'm a mom of two. I have 9-year-old and 6-year-old boys, live in Minneapolis. And one of the things that's neat for me that, goes alongside the writing work that I do, the research work that I do, is that I feel like I'm really living out a lot of what I talk about in my writing because I currently live in Ilhan Omar's congressional district. So politically, a pretty liberal area. And then I actually commute an hour west into rural Minnesota to serve in a county where 2/3 of the voters voted for Trump in 2020. So I really kind of have a foot in both the urban and rural divide. I, live really intensely in both communities. And I hope, sometimes it's difficult, but I hope it really gives me a unique perspective into America in 2022.
I'm sure it drives many challenges for you.
I mean, yeah, gas prices haven't been fun lately.
Only one of the challenges, yes.
Yeah, they're going down.
So, as I mentioned, the title of this new version is Red State Christians, A Journey into White Christian Nationalism and the Wreckage It Leaves Behind. So, what motivated you to come out with the expanded version of the original book?
Yeah, so I feel really lucky to get the opportunity to go back and to make some additions, to make some changes to what I had written in 2019. As you know, as everyone who is with us knows, the world has changed a lot since August of 2019 when this book came out. And when the publisher came to me and said, we'd like to release a new edition, I really wanted to sort of be able to view this 2019 book through the lens of A, COVID, B, the murder of George Floyd and this larger racial reckoning that has been happening in the US and the sort of backlash against that, particularly from white Christians. And then the third thing is the January 6th insurrection. And so I think as I look back at each of these chapters and all the places that I went, I traveled the country in 2018 to speak with Christians all over the country, particularly in conservative contexts. I can see just each part of the book really being shaped anew by these three trends. And you can see the transition in the subtitles. So the first subtitle, which I quibbled with them on a bit, the initial subtitle of the book was Understanding the Voters Who Elected Donald Trump. I really wanted it to be Meet the Voters Who Elected Donald Trump. I approached the book as a journalist and also as a pastor. And so I saw myself really attempting, back in that first edition to make introductions to different Americans. And I really wanted to lift up voices within this book that weren't being covered elsewhere through a pastoral, theological, journalistic lens. And now this new subtitle, I thought it was really important to reference white Christian nationalism in a way that I would not have understood when the book first came out.
Sure.
And one of my, as I address in some of the new material, one of the main opportunities that I had that, again, I'm really grateful for is my own understanding has changed and grown over these last 3 years in understanding the role of race and the role of racism. And, when I first wrote the book, I was a little bit timid around really talking frankly about the role of race when it comes to this movement. And I think I thought that if I spoke more directly, that I might alienate readers. And I think in my own spiritual journey, my own faith journey over these past 3 years, um, I've really felt, Jesus calling me to speak a more clarified truth and to be more courageous with my words, to not always be so measured. And I think I'm just really grateful to have that opportunity, even though it's been, the wreckage it leaves behind for me has been personal, not only political or pastoral.
Well, this is really insightful, and I hope during our conference, as I mentioned, it's titled "How to Write Dangerously." And you just talked about kind of an evolutionary, thought process within your own writing
Yeah.
on that dimension.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I love that title, and I think it's honest because it is dangerous. And I think that I'll just speak for myself. As a white middle-class person, I didn't always have to confront that danger in ways that I have since, again, COVID, the murder of George Floyd, and the insurrection. And I write about in the introduction about when I was on CNN, that a portion of that interview was lifted on Breitbart, and that that was the first time that I really experienced a lot of violent threats and sort of this, and I've experienced it again and again sort of over the years, where you'll write something and it just sort of unleashes like a troll army online on social media. And after it happens a couple times, you sort of learn, okay, I can mute this, but it's been coupled with that real threat of violence that we all as Americans saw on January 6th. And we continue to see even in rural America. There's a lot of movement among militia groups who are really looking to infiltrate into rural America and into rural America politics. And so that sense of danger, I think it's important to be honest about it. And I also think, in some ways, those of us who are white Christians, we're catching up to recognize the danger that has always inherently been with us. And for white women, we have denied the ways that we in our bodies have both been part of sort of the marginalized group, and then both also promoted marginalization of others. So,
mm-hmm. So back to the first book,
yeah.
What overall has been the reaction to it?
Yeah, it's been really great, and it's been a really, journey that I've been grateful to have been on. Initially, after the book came out, I was doing a lot of traveling, a lot of speaking at churches and universities and colleges, at libraries. And one of the things that was really encouraging for me is that a lot of the places that invited me to come and speak about the book were very conservative areas, in places where sometimes I had to be humbled and surprised to remember that people really had a desire to talk about this stuff. And it was often in places, or even at colleges that would have been considered more quote unquote liberal, where I would get smaller turnouts than I would at, the university where I went to, Lenore-Ryan University in North Carolina. And I came there shortly after there had been a Trump rally there. And I just saw, when people live in close proximity to one another, which is something I wrote about in the initial edition extensively, that these relationships do create an opportunity to have more dialogue and do create an opportunity to talk about what's right around us. So that response was really encouraging. As the 2020 election came forward, I sort of experienced a resurgence of interest in the book, which was great. It's interesting. Now you're starting to see the GOP politicians latch onto the phrase Christian nationalism and, proudly proclaim like we are Christian nationalists. You'll see that among some even pastors and conservative Christian leaders. And it's really interesting to be in this place where I, in 2018 wrote the first chapter of this book, which is called, I want to make sure I get the first chapter title correct. It's called Christian Nationalism and 4th of July Church in Dallas, Texas. And so I know people have been talking and writing about these things for a long time. And I'm grateful to see it being written about and to get this opportunity to continue to share the work that I've done.
I'm really glad you have that opportunity too. Um, what material did you add to the second book? Can you go into that in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, I can. So I have a new introduction, what they've called, I think it's the preface to the 2022 edition. And then I have a new conclusion to the 2022 edition. And then there's some minor stuff within the chapters, but mostly it's an extensive new preface and a new conclusion. Um, and again, those are both really helping to frame the rest of the book through the 2022 and beyond lens of COVID, of the murder of George Floyd, and of the January 6th insurrection. And the conclusion of the book really goes into, this idea of the wreckage that it leaves behind. And I write about 3 deaths that I experienced in my personal life and in my congregation that sort of brought forward to me this sense of, we're really in a place of, as American Christians, as white Christians, we're really in a place of, we're experiencing a lot of death and a lot of despair. And we're experiencing, it's getting harder and harder to find the gospel proclaimed, the gospel, shed of the idolatry of nation or of violence or of money or of political ideology. And so I always ultimately get around to a hope for resurrection. And the new version still wants to get to that place. But it really wants to dwell in, like, okay, 3 years later, after this book has come out, what has happened in my life and in the lives of the people that I spoke to. And a lot of it is we're looking around and we're surveying the wreckage of what has been left behind.
Not like things have gotten a lot better over the last 3 years.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, a lot better, say more.
Well, it's just like you said, I mean, just all the terrible things that have happened over the last
Yeah.
3 years. It's just
Yeah.
not a lot of things have gotten better.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, no, I thought you said a lot of things have gotten better.
No. I mean,
hope. Tell me what's
yeah.
gotten.
Well, I mean,
No,
there are some, good things obviously too, but just a lot of serious issues that, we thought they were worse than they'd ever been, and now they're worse than that. I mean,
yes.
that's not an accurate portrayal, I know, but
Yeah.
but in any event, I'd like to read a couple of endorsements for the book, and some of these I think may have been for the first book. I'm not sure if it's the first or the second, but I think they're very important and telling. This one's for Publishers Weekly. An enriching debut. Denker etches a vivid and revealing picture of the moral bargains struck by evangelical Christian Americans. First of all, great things that they said about your book, but can you talk a little bit about the moral bargains that you cover in the book?
Yeah, I like the use of that word bargain because none of this conversation is complete without an economic analysis and without an understanding of the role of money and wealth in everything that we're talking about. And again, I mean, I was very careful, especially in the first edition of the book, to look at sort of the ordinary people who get swept up into this and those who are profiting off of it. And I guess when you're talking about, when we're talking about how things have felt murky and felt sad, I have recently been thinking about, the famous Dr. King quote where it says, he says, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Mm-hmm. And I think with the Alex Jones trial, where you're finally seeing one of these people who has just lied indiscriminately for profit, has not believed his own lies. I think we saw that so much with COVID. So you're starting to see some of these lies being held accountable. I think that's encouraging. But the moral bargains, yeah, I mean, bargain, that word, it speaks to what all of us, I'll put myself in here too, what all of us have been willing to bargain away in order to secure a measure of wealth for ourselves. And I just think that there's a theoretical understanding of that, but there's also just a real acknowledgement of the role of money and wealth in this whole conversation, and how the economic analysis is a part of this.
Yes. I mean, I couldn't agree more. And, that's a topic that I would like to follow up with you on separately later on. um, Here's another quote. This one's from our friend Lisa Sharon Harper, who also, by the way, will be speaking at our upcoming How to Write Dangerously conference. She says, Angela Denker's Red State Christians is a pure revelation. Denker's empathetic ear combines with dogged reporting to reveal Trumpism's genesis and the nature of its stronghold in red state America. The book is essential reading for all Americans. How would you describe the nature of the Trumpism stronghold on some Americans?
Yeah, I think I would not have expected. So I would have expected Trump's numbers to decrease more than they did in the 2020 election. And you really saw those numbers hold strong and even increase in some. And so I think when you're talking about Trumpism post-2020 versus post-2016, there was a sense, and I think you see this in some of the early books that came out about the 2016 election. There was a sense that, wow, what was this crazy thing that happened in American politics? And instead of acknowledging that, Trump exposed a trend, and he exposed, some of who we are as Americans, rather than creating something entirely new. And so, the work of people like Kristen Dumais and Jesus and John Wayne, the work of other historians in documenting the past, Robert P. Jones and White Too Long, really documenting the long-standing history behind where we are today as Americans. I think that gets into why this is such a stronghold, because it's been in the works for a long time, and it's attached to so many other trends. And also attached to, I was talking to another pastor this morning. I'm at a Lutheran conference right now. And he and I both serve in rural contexts. And we were just talking about that there's, I think you can't detach that from this sense of despair and this sense of, high rates of drug addiction, of alcoholism, all of these things that are not excuses for white America, but they're realities that I don't think we have still understood how to talk about in a way that's helpful.
No question. And I know what I heard from people outside of the United States when the 2016 election occurred was just they were like aghast. They just couldn't believe it. Mm-hmm. And I was pretty shocked myself, but that was definitely the consistent reaction that I heard from everybody that I know from outside the United States. Mm-hmm. So finally, another quote, this one from Brian McLaren, who will also be speaking at the How to Write Dangerously conference. We see a pattern here. Brian says, books like Angela's can help mend the tears in our social fabric, if you'll dare to let her be your guide in a tour across the nation. So no question, we have tears to mend. How would you say that your book helps do that?
Yeah, I think Brian and I were optimistic about that. I don't know that it, I do. I've become a little bit more cynical since, I really did have a hope. I had a hope, and I saw the conversations happening, and I've seen, the openness that is possible, particularly in the local church and in local congregations. But I think there's been an inability to acknowledge, and that's why, again, I wanted to use this word wreckage in the new title. There's been an inability to fully acknowledge, and I think I'll put this blame on church leaders in some cases and on Christian leaders. And maybe this is where writing dangerously comes in. There's an inability to fully acknowledge the depth of the pain and the human sorrow and the human sin that has happened around these trends in the last few years. And so I think we're seeing some of that work come out with some of these movements, the New Evangelicals movement, the movement around Church too. We saw, the SBC and the sex abuse crisis in the Southern Baptist Convention. So there's like all this pain being thrown out into the world, and Christian leaders have an opportunity to be a place for us. Jesus says, put my yoke upon you, and Jesus will carry our burdens, and we can bear one another's burdens together. I think there's an opportunity to do that. But I think, particularly among white Americans, we've been hesitant to enter into this work emotionally. And we've made it be too theoretical, too academic, and have been afraid to really enter into the emotion of what's happened in our families and in our communities.
Mm-hmm. Well, for what it's worth, books like yours and in the How to Heal Our Divides, books that I've done, they're highlighting a lot of organizations who are actually doing something.
Yes.
Trying to resolve some of these different. But between books like yours, the other ones that you've mentioned, all the good books that have been written about anti-racism specifically, at least there's a light shining on these issues, stronger than what I've ever seen it, at least in my life. And that's causing awareness, and it's causing angst in a lot of territory. Things are going to continue to get worse, I think, a little bit before they start getting better. But I do see hope in that finally we're being forced, whether we like it or not, to wrestle with some of these things that have been swept under the rug for so long.
Absolutely.
And the wrestling is going to be hard, and it's going to take a long time. But I do feel hope of more and more people are wrestling. More and more people are paying attention to these things. And there's a lot of these organizations that are doing really good work, to help mitigate, help bring back civility, et cetera, et cetera. So for what it's worth, I was pretty pessimistic a lot of times during this too, but I'm feeling a little bit hopeful.
Well, you're giving it to me, so keep preaching.
So what would be the one thing you'd say you'd like readers to take away from the new version of the book?
So when I was first speaking about the book and I would go to events, the most important thing that I wanted to communicate oftentimes was this truth that, on its face sounds really axiomatic, but people, as it sank in, they kind of, oh yeah. I really wanted to help people to know Jesus is not American. And so it begins
this concept.
Bam. It really begins this work of decentering ourselves from the role as savior and the role as, always being on the right side, rather than
the world's not flat.
rather than
where you been?
Rather than recognizing our place as empire, But so what I want people to take away from this new version, especially people if they've looked at the first version or if they have been studying this stuff for a while, the shift that I've become convinced is even more important and opens more doors into understanding and into growth and into better being able to follow Jesus, is to really understand that Jesus is not white. And that opens, such a bigger truth. And I think gets more at the actual danger that we're in right now because, we've begun to unpack the history of this movement within American politics. But for me, as a pastor, as a Lutheran, as a theologian, the bigger conversation is this is really a conflict between a theology of glory and a theology of the cross. And theology of glory, we go back to AD 300 when Roman Emperor Constantine on his deathbed decides to adopt Christianity. And Christianity goes from being the persecuted minority religion of converted Jewish people for the most part and some Gentiles to the religion of empire and to the religion of power. And this alignment between, that same alignment between religious leaders and government leaders is the same alignment that crucified Jesus. That begins this alignment of Christianity with empire. And that lends itself to a theology of glory, which teaches that if you follow Jesus, if you are a good Christian, quote unquote, then you're going to succeed in earthly goods. You're going to become wealthy. I mean, it's almost a way to understand the prosperity gospel.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, as Ecclesiastes says, nothing is new under the sun.
Really?
But to understand, that Jesus is not white, it helps move understanding this whole topic beyond just our understanding as Americans and into the threat of the global authoritarian movement that we saw with Viktor Orban addressing, CPAC a few weeks ago, and to see the broader implications of what's happening in our world beyond, understanding this as a partisan battle between Democrats and Republicans. We've really moved beyond that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I know you're in the throes of introducing this new version of the book, but are there any future projects that you're able to speak about yet or not?
Yeah, I'm in works on my second book project, which is a little bit less overtly political. The working title is Disinheritance: What I Had to Lose to Find My Grandpa's God. And it traces the story of my grandpa, who had been a pastor, was very outspoken at the time of civil rights, Vietnam War, and he got divorced around this time, and he was sort of kicked out of churches and died as someone who felt utterly abandoned by the church. Had told me, I will never set foot in the Lutheran church again.
Wow.
Yet still remained at his heart a pastor. From sending out these email sermons to being so rooted in the Bible to, visiting folks in the hospital to, in his last moments when he's in the hospital, he's praying with the doctors and the nurses for them. And it's sort of been this journey for me since 2017 of leaving my large church that I was working at in Orange County, California. And from this really place of privilege within the church to leaving that job, to writing this book, to now working in rural America, and sort of finding my grandpa's story in my own story and recognizing that perhaps the gospel that I'm looking to find is more in the rejection that he experienced than in what I used to see as my own potential success in a large church context.
Wow. Wow. That's going to be a really emotional book for you to write.
Yeah. Yeah. It's one of those things where your ancestors go with you, and I'm just hopeful to find the right place to put that out, and I look forward to sharing it hopefully in the near future.
Yes, good. Well, please, stay in touch with that. I think that sounds really wonderful. Very, really compelling book. I know it's going to be.
Thank you.
So again, the title of Angela's latest is Red State Christians: A Journey into White Christian Nationalism and the Wreckage It Leaves Behind. You can find Angela on Twitter on Angela_Denker. So Angela, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate your work, and I'm always excited to be able to talk with you about it.
Yeah, you too. And I'm looking forward to How to Write Dangerously.
Yes, I think it's going to be a great conference. I'm really looking forward to it a lot.
Thank you.